Have you ever felt that, despite all your effort, your life seems to go in circles, as if something invisible were holding you back? What if I told you this happens because most people seek transformation in the wrong place? They believe they need to wait for the world to change first, when, in reality, the key lies within the mind. There is a silent lineage of human beings, almost like angels living here on earth, who have already understood this. They are those who dared to look within and discovered that the mind is not merely a reflection of reality, but the instrument that creates it. Among them, one man stood out, Itzhak Bentov. His work challenged common sense, disrupted established beliefs, and proved that it is possible to accelerate achievements and materialize dreams in a practical and accessible way. Get ready, because in this video you will learn about a method that doesn't depend on luck or magical formulas. It was developed to train the mind in a scientific, direct, and powerful way. A method that can transform not only the way you think, but the way you feel and act. And here's the point that may surprise you. You don't need to wait months or years to notice results. When applied correctly, this method begins to bring rapid changes. Mental clarity, focus, energy, and even the feeling that your dreams are already within reach. Stay with me until the end of this video, because you will discover how to use this process step by step, how to integrate the practices into your daily life, and how to enter the same stream of consciousness as those who decided to take on the role of creators of their own lives. When it comes to transformation, most people look outward. They think life improves when they get a new job, when they enter a different relationship, when they have more money, or when something external changes. But the truth, and perhaps the hardest to accept, is that everything begins in the mind. The root of change, the turning point, is born within one's own being. It's not about magic, it's not about believing in coincidences or sudden luck. It's training, it's mental discipline, it's science applied to the invisible territory of consciousness. Itzhak Bentov, an engineer and consciousness researcher, was someone who dared to take this understanding beyond theory. In the silence of his own room, with improvised instruments, he began to investigate what many believed to be unreachable mysticism. He wasn't seeking to create dogmas. He sought to experiment. His explorations led him to understand that the mind is the greatest laboratory ever created, and that each of us carries within ourselves the resources to shape our own reality. He didn't speak of an unattainable power reserved for the few. On the contrary, he revealed that the mind can be trained like any other human capacity. Just as one exercises the body to make it stronger, it is possible to train the mind to become more stable, creative, and clear. What seems supernatural begins to take shape when one realizes that the brain responds to stimuli, that thoughts create patterns, and that patterns create life. This starting point dismantles the idea that we are trapped by circumstances. When Bentov spoke about consciousness, he didn't use convoluted language to distance people. He used simplicity to show that anyone could access this inner space. He said that by turning inward, we open doors that remain locked for those who insist on seeking only outside. And here is the provocation that opens the journey. If everything begins in the mind, then each emotion, each decision, each daily gesture carries the seed of what we will harvest. But how do we cultivate this seed? How do we strengthen this invisible muscle that governs the way we see the world? It is at this point that we enter the next level of what Bentov discovered, a practical path to train the mind, as real and accessible as any physical exercise. When Bentov began to deepen his experiments, he realized something that today seems obvious, but at the time sounded revolutionary. The mind could be trained like a muscle. The more one practiced, the more it responded. The more one took care of internal states, the greater the capacity for concentration, learning, and clarity. He discovered that moments of deep relaxation were not merely pauses for rest, but doorways to a broader intelligence. Breathing was one of the first pathways. Not that automatic, shallow breathing that everyone does without noticing, but conscious, deep breathing capable of slowing down brain frequency and opening space for a different state of presence. When the body becomes still, the brain changes rhythm, and what seemed distant becomes accessible. Breathing, then, becomes a connecting thread between the physical and the mental, between what is tangible and what manifests only in silence. Along with this, he introduced the practice of visualization. To visualize, in the sense that Bentov taught, was more than remembering an image. It was training the mind to create and sustain scenarios with clarity. By working this ability, people reported improvement in memory, expansion of creativity, and even the capacity to solve problems more intuitively. Visualization functioned as training for the brain, activating areas that would otherwise remain unexplored. Another pillar that proved powerful was affirmation. Words repeated aloud or in thought, as long as they carried intention, slowly penetrated the subconscious. Just as water shapes stone through constant contact, the repetition of positive affirmations altered the way a person thought about themselves and about the world. It wasn't about deceiving oneself or repeating empty phrases, but about consciously choosing which ideas to feed, until they became convictions. These practices, breathing, visualization, and affirmation, came together in relaxation. And to relax, in Bentov's method, was not to disconnect from the world, but to enter a state where the mind could reorganize itself. It was like clearing a plot of land to plant new seed. With conscious relaxation, the brain stopped spending energy on unnecessary noise and became capable of accessing deeper levels of perception. Bentov said that, just as muscles grow with regular effort, the mind flourishes when subjected to consistent exercises. And from this training emerged an even more fascinating effect: the entry into states of consciousness that altered the very way the individual perceived reality. Among these states, there was one he highlighted as essential, a state that opened doors to creativity, to intuition, and to a calm that didn't depend on external circumstances. This state was called alpha. Bentov always said that the human mind is not a machine that functions in a linear way, but rather a living organism that responds to rhythms. When he began to closely observe how the brain behaved in different states of consciousness, something caught his attention. There was a specific frequency range that completely changed the way we think, feel, and even how we perceive the body. This range was the so-called alpha state, characterized by brain activity of approximately 10 cycles per second. In scientific language, this frequency was already known. But the way Bentov interpreted and applied this knowledge made the experience accessible to anyone willing to practice. In the alpha state, the mind doesn't behave as it does in the normal waking state, where thoughts run in an accelerated and often chaotic manner. At this point, it slows down, finds a more stable cadence, and this creates an internal space that transforms perception. What seemed complicated before gains clarity. What was previously a source of anxiety dissolves into serenity. Many people who practiced Bentov's exercises reported that, upon reaching this state, they felt as if their mind had tuned into something greater, as if a new intelligence emerged within them. It is no exaggeration to say that the alpha state opens a door to creative and intuitive dimensions that, in the common waking state, remain dormant. One of the most fascinating aspects is that, in this state, intuition intensifies. Ideas seem to sprout from places we cannot rationally explain. Problems that previously seemed unsolvable find unexpected solutions. It's as if the brain connects dots that were previously scattered, revealing paths that were invisible before. And this is not about superstition. It's a biological process. The brain, when functioning in alpha waves, better integrates the hemispheres, allowing creativity and logic to dialogue harmoniously. Beyond the mental realm, the body also responds to this state. Studies have shown that blood pressure tends to drop, heart rate finds a more stable rhythm, and the general sensation is one of physical and emotional balance. Some people even report relief from pain or muscle tension. It's as if the entire organism takes advantage of this state to reorganize itself, recover energy, and align. Bentov made a point of emphasizing that accessing alpha was not the privilege of isolated monks or advanced meditation practitioners. It was a natural ability. With simple techniques of deep breathing, progressive relaxation, and directing attention, Anyone could induce this state in themselves. The secret lay in regular practice, in the daily cultivation of this mental discipline. The more one practiced, the faster it became to enter alpha, until this condition began to manifest spontaneously at different moments of daily life. For many, this experience was a watershed. Suddenly, they realized that the mind was not condemned to be a hostage to stress, rushing, and external agitation. There was an internal resource, always available, that could be activated to bring clarity, serenity, and creativity. Alpha was not just a brain state. It was a key to accessing a deeper level of one's own consciousness. And it was at this point that Bentov opened a new frontier. He realized that, upon reaching alpha, it wasn't just about relaxing or feeling inner peace. This state could be actively used for something greater, to cultivate internal images, project scenarios, stimulate imagination and, with this, begin to shape external reality from what was created within. Conscious visualization, when practiced at this level of consciousness, gained transformative power. It was as if the mind, in alpha, was more plastic, more receptive, more willing to register what one chose to feed it. And this realization naturally led to the next step, where Bentov clearly differentiated two processes: visualizing and imagining. Both had their function, both were tools, and both would become central to the method he would consolidate as a path of self-transformation. When Bentov began to talk about the powers of the mind, he made a distinction that seemed simple but carried profound implications: the difference between visualizing and imagining. For many, these two terms sounded like synonyms. But for him, understanding the subtlety between one and the other was essential to mastering the potential of consciousness. To visualize, Bentov said, is to bring to mind something we already know, a memory, a scene, an object, or an experience already lived. It's like when someone recalls the face of a friend or the color of a flower they saw in a garden. This exercise activates areas linked to memory, reinforces the clarity of recollections, and strengthens the capacity for attention. It's a way to keep alive the connection with what already exists. Imagination, on the other hand, goes beyond. To imagine is to create what has never been seen before, to generate images, scenarios, and unprecedented possibilities within the mental field. It's to open space for the new. For Bentov, this act was one of the most powerful human resources because it allowed not only to remember the past, but to conceive futures that could become reality. In this sense, conscious imagination was a creative act, a way to shape the invisible until the visible began to organize itself around it. He observed that, by uniting these two practices, visualizing and imagining, within the alpha state, the results multiplied. The mind, more receptive and plastic in this state, registered with intensity what was projected internally. People who practiced reported that they began to feel the internal images with such force that it became almost tangible. It wasn't just an intellectual exercise. The body reacted, emotions responded, and vital energy seemed to align with what was being created mentally. This process had surprising effects not only in the psychological field, but also in the physical and emotional. There were reports of healing from old traumas, simply because the person, by visualizing scenes of past pain, managed to recreate them in their mind differently, bringing understanding and peace where there had been suffering before. Conscious imagination, in this sense, became a therapeutic tool, allowing one to rewrite the internal narrative and release the weight of painful memories. In the creative field, the results were equally fascinating. Artists, scientists, and inventors began to use these practices to expand their creative capacities. By consciously imagining, new concepts emerged, new works were conceived, innovative solutions arose from areas that seemed blocked. For Bentov, this demonstrated that the mind not only reproduces what exists, but has the intrinsic capacity to generate what does not yet exist, and this is what makes us co-creators of reality. Most impressive is that these practices, when done regularly, began to manifest in daily life. Small changes in behavior, more aligned decisions, new opportunities that seemed to appear out of nowhere, but were actually being attracted by this mental attunement. Bentov saw this as proof that thought, when well directed, is a force that shapes external circumstances. And here is an essential point. This differentiation between visualizing and imagining was not just a theoretical curiosity, but the foundation for the next step of the method. For if the mind could, consciously, construct images and scenarios, then it could also project goals and live them internally even before they happened. It was like training the brain to feel the realization of something future as if it were already happening in the present. This discovery changed everything. Conscious imagination ceased to be merely a creative exercise and became a bridge between the inner world and the materialization of objectives in the outer world. And it is at this point that Bentov takes an even greater leap. He shows how to project mental goals with such intensity that the brain and body naturally begin to work to make real what was first experienced in the mind. Bentov believed that the mind was not just a mirror of reality, but also a projector. What was repeated with intensity within it, sooner or later, found a way to express itself in the external world. It was from this understanding that he consolidated the culminating point of his method, the practice of setting mental goals. This practice consisted of something much deeper than simply thinking positive. It wasn't enough to wish vaguely, nor to repeat phrases disconnected from inner experience. For a mental goal to become alive, it was necessary to project it with such intensity and clarity that the brain truly believed it was already happening. The secret was this: to feel the achievement internally before it manifested externally. When someone mentally experiences a goal as if it had already been achieved, the body reacts. The heart accelerates, muscles respond, neurotransmitters are released. The entire organism aligns with the experience. For the brain, there is no difference between what is being lived in the physical world and what is being vividly lived in the mental field. This is one of the most fascinating discoveries of modern neuroscience, but Bentov already intuited this in his home experiments, decades ago. He used to say that the mind is like a magnet. What it repeats and sustains internally ends up attracting compatible experiences in the external world. Not by magic, but because, by aligning with a goal, the person naturally begins to act in a manner coherent with it. The brain, convinced of the internal reality, directs thoughts, emotions, and attitudes almost automatically, shortening the path between the ideal and the concrete. This process also helped eliminate one of the greatest obstacles to achievement: doubt. Normally, when someone establishes a goal, the rational mind immediately questions: is it possible? Will I be able to do it? This constant questioning erodes confidence and creates a distance between desire and realization. The practice of setting mental goals, however, reduces this space. When the goal is lived with intensity within the mind, doubt loses strength, because the brain has already experienced the result. Conviction grows and energy turns to action. Another fundamental aspect was clarity. Bentov taught that it wasn't enough to want to be happy or be successful. It was necessary to give form, color, texture, and emotion to the objective. The more specific the projected scenario, the stronger the impact on the subconscious. Clarity created a kind of internal map, and the brain began to seek, unconsciously, the paths that would lead to that destination. It is at this point that the practice ceases to be merely mental and becomes transformative. People who trained this technique reported significant changes not only in their external results, but also in how they perceived themselves. By projecting goals and living them internally, they began to feel more capable, more secure, and more aligned with their own essence. Self-esteem grew, and with it the courage to act. And, as time passed, the results became visible. Projects were completed, relationships were healed, new opportunities arose. It wasn't coincidence, but consequence of the coherence between what was lived internally and what manifested externally. Bentov showed that, by mastering this practice, the individual ceased to be merely a spectator of life and became an active participant in creating their own reality. This point of the method was the most powerful, because it revealed that goals are not just intentions cast into the future, but experiences that can be felt in the present. And, by being lived now, they create a silent force that begins to reorganize the very paths of life. And it is precisely at this point that the inevitable question arises. If the mind can project and sustain a goal until it becomes real, what transformations can happen when this process is practiced with discipline, over weeks, months, and years? It is on this horizon that the deepest results begin to emerge. When Bentov's practices began to spread, the reports from participants drew attention. Many described changes so remarkable that it was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just about a momentary feeling of well-being, but transformations that reflected in different areas of life, from memory to mood, from creativity to physical health. People reported, for example, that they could concentrate longer on their daily tasks. What previously seemed confusing or scattered became clear and objective. Students noticed they learned more easily, professionals reported greater focus at work, and artists saw their inspiration flow without the usual block. The mind, trained in states of relaxation and focus, seemed to reorganize itself in a more efficient way. In addition, there were consistent reports of improvement in memory. Many stated that they recalled forgotten details or that they could retain recent information more clearly. This reinforced the idea that the practice of visualization and states like alpha not only stimulated creativity, but also strengthened the most basic cognitive functions. In the field of creativity, the results were even more impressive. People who never considered themselves creative began to develop new ideas, original solutions, and even talents they believed they didn't possess. It was as if the practice had unlocked a part of the mind that had always been there, but remained dormant. Bentov liked to say that we all carry an artist and an inventor within us, and that mental training was the key to freeing them. But perhaps the most surprising point was the connection between mind and body. Many practitioners reported improvements in their physical health. Chronic pains diminished, blood pressure balanced, sleep became deeper and more restorative. The explanation, according to Bentov, lay in the fact that the body responds to mental states. When the mind enters into harmony, the body follows this rhythm, reorganizing functions and recovering natural balance. This understanding reinforced the idea that body and mind are not separate, but aspects of the same system. Thoughts and emotions, far from being merely subjective experiences, have a direct impact on biology. The way we think can accelerate or slow healing, can increase or reduce vital energy. And when conscious thought is trained, the body responds with vitality. Another important point was emotional transformation. People who carried feelings of insecurity or anxiety reported that, after weeks of practice, they experienced a greater sense of calm and confidence. Not because external problems had disappeared, but because the way of dealing with them had changed. Mental training offered tools to observe situations with clarity, without getting lost in the internal dramas that normally drain energy. Over time, these results accumulated, generating significant changes in lifestyle. Someone who previously saw themselves limited by insecurities began to take more risks, to make bold decisions, to seek new paths. Another who felt trapped in automatic routines began to have energy and creativity to reinvent their trajectory. Bentov showed that, by strengthening consciousness, a domino effect was created that spread through all areas of life. And here is the most intriguing point. These transformations were not reserved for a chosen few, but accessible to anyone willing to practice. The method didn't require dogmas, nor adherence to specific beliefs, but only discipline and dedication. What began as a simple breathing or visualization exercise could become the beginning of an internal revolution capable of completely changing the course of a life. And thus, the reports of transformation served as living testimony to the power of the method. But the real question that lingered was, what happens when we take this knowledge beyond individual practice, when we apply this potential on a collective scale, in our relationships, in our way of living in the world?